The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
So we are here today on Titans of Nuclear with Dick Meserve, who's a former chairman of the NRC, and quite frankly, one of the most well-known people throughout the industry. When I first got started talking to everyone from Paul Dickman to God knows who, everyone keeps saying, oh, you got to talk to Richard Meserve, Dick Meserve, he's the guy. So super excited to finally get the chance to sit down with you today.
Oh, glad to join you.
Yeah. So please, as we like to do on Titans of Nuclear, we'd love to just get to know someone's background even before they were in the nuclear sector. What was it for you?
Well, let me say I sort of backed into nuclear by accident. I mean that literally by accident. I am someone who has a PhD in physics, actually condensed matter physics, nothing to do with nuclear energy, and a law degree. And I was working in the science advisor's office in the Carter administration. And I just finished up a big project for the science advisor. And it was March 1979. And science advisor came into the office and said to me, gee, we seem to be having a problem at 3 Mile Island. So I got very much in the middle of the nuclear business there, and that there was a sort of a team of staff people inside the White House that was following the accident. And I was very actively, and I basically ran that staff level process. And then was influential in forming the Kemeny Commission, which was the group that studied the accident for the president and suggested various changes in how nuclear was regulated. And then was sort of ran the staff level part of the process about the president's response to the Kemeny Commission. So I was very much involved in nuclear and had not been at all before that.
Yeah. And can you share with us a little bit about the perspective at that time of the administration and what they were thinking with respect to 3 Mile Island? Was it because I've heard like mixed stories about Carter and his level of interest and liking towards nuclear energy, everything from he used to scrub out, the decommissioned tanks and therefore he hated it, to someone told me when they commissioned a nuclear Navy sub, that was a nuclear sub with his name on it, he shed a tear because he was so happy about it. So do you know where Carter actually fell in the spectrum?
Well, my impression that he was always very favorable towards nuclear, actually. He'd been part of the Rickover Navy, as you've indicated, and that was really a turning point for him in his life. And he was always an advocate, at least I perceived him to be an advocate, a realist nonetheless, but an advocate for nuclear. Yeah. I'll tell you one funny story that reflected him is that I did not go with him, but the president flew to 3 Mile Island in a helicopter with the science advisor and visited the plant, visited the control room, talked to the people. And the amazing thing was that they had forgotten to zero his dosimeter before he arrived. And so everyone who was with him had trivial doses, except the president, who had this quite substantial dose on his dosimeter. Fortunately, he was sufficiently sophisticated about nuclear that it didn't make a big deal for him, so it was okay. But I mean, it always amuses me, the one person you'd want to make sure you had accurate readings on didn't. The other funny thing I'd say about that is that, to sort of move us on a little bit, is that one of the outcomes of the Kennedy Commission report, which the president endorsed and the Congress allowed, was to give exclusive powers to the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the event of an accident. That one of the lessons from 3 Mile Island was how hard it was for the commission to actually make decisions, because at that time you needed to have 5 people have an opportunity for a vote. And that was seen as, I think correctly, as being one that we needed to act swiftly. You needed to give the president, because you know, the chairman, some unique powers, as well as the opportunity to be the spokesman for the agency. And so there's one voice speaking in the event of an accident.
And what were some of those powers that, in the case of an accident, is it, like, what are the decisions that the chairman has to make? Is it essentially evacuate or not evacuate, or is there a more complex, set of decisions?
Well, you're trying, obviously, this huge public concern, and you don't, so the situation is one where there's a very delicate situation. The NRC has to be on top of the situation technically, be available. The licensee has the responsibility to run the plant. And that continues through the accident. The NRC obviously closely monitors what's going on. And before dramatic actions are taken, the licensee almost assuredly would talk to the NRC about what they're contemplating and get their approval. But actually, in a formal sense, the NRC might need to have authorization to do something that's outside the tech specs, for example, which the NRC would be fully prepared to do in an accident situation if it was a wise action. But if you disagreed with the licensee, technically you'd issue an order and tell them not to do it.
I see. So if they wanted to, let's say, jack into a coolant pipe somewhere, normally you need to get permission from the NRC to do that if it was just a normal operation. But in the case of an emergency, that might be something that they might want to do or not want to do. And that's when the commission might get directly involved and say, yeah, we don't need to go through 3 months of paperwork to, allow you to create a valve on this, on this coolant pipe or something.
Sure, that's exactly right. You may give them a immediate authorization to do something. But and of course, the amusing thing about this story is that there's only one other chairman who ever exercised emergency powers. And this came home to roost in a certain sense. I was the chairman at 9/11. And all of a sudden, we were very worried about, as you may recall, about the fact that nuclear plants might well be targeted. There was some information that we were all reading about the fact that Al-Qaeda had thought about attacks on nuclear plants. So, I exercised authority to put the plants on highest alert, and was very actively involved over the next several months, actually, on basically the response to 3 Mile Island. Spent a lot of time in the White House Situation Room as a result of that. As part of the process was there was always great interest in other cabinet departments about what the NRC was doing and so forth.
And what can a plant do in that highest alert mode if what they're worried about is an airplane attack? It's not like they can set up their own Iron Dome missile defense system or something, can they?
Well, no, we were obviously not able to do anything about airplane attacks other than we established no-fly zones over nuclear plants. And you may remember that they were combat air patrols that were deployed. And so if there happened to be an aircraft attack, we did have the possibility that the Department of Defense might take some action to avert an airplane attack on a nuclear plant. And we were constantly monitoring and in coordination with the DoD on that. But we were giving instructions on licensees as to put them at the highest alert level. We basically shut down the owner-controlled areas for public access. We took steps to assure capability to heighten scrutiny to make sure that a ground attack was
ground attack.
Yeah. And we would be, and we would be coordinating, and our licensees in particular would be coordinating with local forces to enable that there was some capability. So that might be state police. In some cases, it could be the National Guard that was involved. And then we get constant reports from licensees as to suspicious actions. There was a lot of intelligence activity that was directed at, what are the threats? What are we seeing? Any preliminary actions? And, we did have particular heightened sensitivity to aircraft, to possible intrusions. I can remember being woken up in the middle of the night to get a call that someone had gone over the fence at Seabrook. And I'm sure there were lights going on all over the east coast of the United States as this report went on. So, we reduced the number of people in the plant, heightened, obviously, the security presence, reduced the number of people in the plants in the event of an attack. There wouldn't be, people were needlessly in the middle of what could have been a firefight. So in any event, by morning, we discovered that what had come over the fence was a wild turkey. And it had set off the sensors. I'm not talking about a bottle either. I'm talking about an actual wild turkey.
Talking about a wild goose chase. Yeah,
it was a wild goose chase. So that was my. So I started out. That's how I got involved in was basically at OSTP, and then my boss, the science advisor, became the president of the National Academy of Sciences. And in 1986, the Chernobyl accident happened. And the our National Academy has always had a very close association with the Russian Academy. It's a hugely important issue when arms control issues, because the technical people actually knew each other and trusted each other, and made it possible to actually have arms control agreements. And so 1986 occurred. Frank Press, the science advisor, now then the president of the academy, called me and said, we're no doubt going to have some activities with the Russian Academy and some studies that we will do in the United States. I just want to put you on alert. So I was involved over the next several years with activities both with Russia, and in particular in the US, we were looking more at DOE plants and their nuclear facilities and the implications of the Chernobyl accident for them.
And what were the concerns there? I guess given how different the DOE plants are, or I mean, these weren't like the Hanford plants, are they? So those would be the only ones that were like graphite core, similar to Chernobyl.
Yes, that's right. It was the graphite plant, the N reactor in particular at Hanford, which was still in operation, was a graphite, very old, with a graphite moderator, a prismatic core. So it was and we looked at the vulnerability of all the DOE plants as well, and after Chernobyl. And that actually did result in the decision that the N reactor should shut down.
Yeah.
Not for the same, it didn't have a positive void coefficient the way the RBMK reactors at Chernobyl did, but it had other problems. It was a very old reactor.
Yeah.
So that sort of got me into, so it was really two accidents as much as anything else that got me by accident into the nuclear business.
Yeah. And then, so when was your introduction to the commission? What prompted that?
Well, I had been, as part of, I was a partner at Covington and Burling, which is a big Washington law firm. And I had a diverse practice. It was basically looked at science and technical issues, given my background. And among them were examination of nuclear issues, but mostly on the materials side. So I had experience with the NRC and with officials at the NRC as a result of materials work rather than basically, I did some reactor work, but very little. And it turned out that when Clinton was in office, it was a retirement of the then chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Clinton personnel people called the National Academy of Sciences and said, "Is there anyone you'd recommend?" And I'd been doing a whole bunch of things for the National Academy of Sciences. So I then got asked if I would do it. And I always said I stayed in Washington, that if an interesting federal job came along, I would take it. I wasn't lobbying for this. This just came out of the blue.
Wow.
So I agreed to do it. And there's a funny story associated with that as well, is that part of the process involves confirmation by the Senate. And I was having lunch in the cafeteria at Covington with a former partner, and I mentioned to him that I was going up to see Senator Chafee that afternoon, who headed the relevant committee that I was going to have an informal meeting with him. Oh, and he mentioned, well, please say, my partner said to me, well, please say hello to him. He was my roommate at Deerfield Academy, which is a sort of a prep school in New England.
Oh my gosh.
So I went up to see Senator Chafee, and I mentioned that my colleague had asked me to say hello. And we spent the next hour talking about Deerfield Academy, which I knew nothing about. But he was telling me stories about what they had done together and so forth. So then he very promptly scheduled a hearing. And I went into the hearing, and there was a chemical regulatory commission. I never even heard of it. We had a guy who was also being subject to this public hearing. He got all the questions. I made an opening statement, got a few cream puff questions. That was it. And so I was a little surprised. I thought I was going to get grilled. I wasn't. It was very pleasant. And I came out and I got a report that the committee had recommended my confirmation, basically immediately. So I didn't think anything about it. I had counted on it. I was told it would take several months to get through the Senate. And it turned out that I happened to know there was I think his title is the Sergeant at Arms in the Senate. He's an influential figure, much more influential than the name would suggest, I hadn't even quite focused who was the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate, but he was a friend of mine. And in another job. And he put me on the consent calendar. And so the next thing I knew, I got a call and said, "You've been confirmed."
Like all in 5 minutes, the whole thing.
It took about a week after I got out of the committee hearing.
That's so funny.
And the funny thing is that the Clinton White House Personnel Office called me and said, "How did you do it?" And I said, "It's by accident." So I had lightning speed through, and I actually hadn't fully disengaged myself. So I actually delayed my being sworn in for a week or two so I could
wrap up things with clients.
Wrap up things and be able to pass things off. So that brought me to the commission in 1999, and I stayed until 2003.
Great. And then, so obviously we know, so September 11th was in that time period. That was, one of the more momentous events. And then I guess after that, did you oversee a lot of, besides like the emergency powers, part of it, was there, upgrades and changes and stuff that happened as a result that was under your purview as well?
Well, we did have, had upgraded we issued a series of orders that basically upgraded the security function at nuclear power plants. We went into the highest level, as I mentioned earlier, right on immediately after the event, the same day, the plane was crashed. And I had been expecting we might be at the higher level for maybe a week or two. It ended up being months because there was no real way, based on the intelligence briefing, to say, okay, that the threat has gone away. There was continuing noise in the system, I would have to say. It's like an amplifier where the volume is turned all the way up and everything that comes through is viewed as a signal, and a lot of it was just noise, as it turned out, because we didn't know that. So we did various steps to upgrade the security. Had a lot of interaction with the operators to make sure that they were alert, and then we would be constantly dealing with them as there was threat information, most of which turned out to be like the wild turkey story,
Yeah.
but nonetheless required, that attention by us. So that was, and basically the security stuff has basically become more regular after that. But with the idea that the force on force testing that we did and so forth was something that got a lot more serious after 9/11. And you had an expert team of attackers that were, I would presume, much more capable than a terrorist team would likely be.
Yeah, and so what's the theory behind all this? Because it seems to me like it's not a very credible scenario that you have like an elite SWAT team come in and penetrate even a normal containment without upgraded security measures and be able to actually do anything that serious other than cause fear and panic. I get the fear part. Like if someone's attacking a nuclear plant, that's scary no matter what, even if they can't do any damage to it. But in terms of actual risk associated with it, it doesn't seem that out of all the things that a team of terrorist SWAT people could do, I mean, they could just go into an elementary school and kill 200 people in 5 minutes, and that seems to me a lot more likely and scary than them getting into a containment building before the local police show up or the local army shows up.
Well, I have to say that it was believed at the time, and I think it's still the case, that people think there would be unique concerns that would be raised if a successful attack were made at a nuclear power plant. This is part of the backdrop of people's fear of accidents at nuclear power plants, and that might be exploited in a way that would have even greater influence than an attack on a much more vulnerable site, but one that wouldn't be as dramatic. So and the idea is to have a very expert attack team, just so you have confidence that a group that is less capable would have an even greater difficulty of attacking. And so there would be, and we learned things. So these attackers do find vulnerabilities, less so these days because we've done a lot of these tests and people have become more sophisticated. But in the early times, you could find vulnerabilities that they would exploit, and you would have a lesson that would come out of that about what needs to be done to upgrade the security. So that I strongly support the idea of force-on-force drills involving a skilled team.
I guess I'm just wondering though, what's the maximum credible accident that they imagine would happen? Because even if they messed up enough equipment to trigger a meltdown, you still have the whole containment structure preventing the release of radionuclides that would, actually, cause serious damage. And even in the case of Fukushima, where we lost containment, no one really died from the radiation. So I guess I'm wondering, what was what's the hypothesis that terrorists could come in, and what actually is the worst case scenario that they were imagining?
Well, let me say, we would worried about the possibility there could be a severe accident that resulted in a breach of containment and the dispersal of radioactive material. It is in fact the case that there were no radiation-related deaths at Fukushima, but there were huge adverse societal implications of the accident, huge economic costs, a fact that a significant part of an agricultural area is still foreclosed from use as a result of the accident.
Yeah, but that's not a result of radiation. That's a result of our reaction to it.
Oh yes, it's not. The adverse impacts from radiation were not the source of the real damage in Fukushima. It was lots of other things, but the damage was huge, hundreds of billions of dollars, and huge disruption of people's lives. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people died as a result of the evacuations. And this was a result that they've now learned something. They should have sheltered people and done more orderly evacuations. But they took people out of intensive care units and put them in the back of trucks and so forth to get them out of there in a hurry.
Right.
And people died.
Right.
There's been a lot that's been learned about that. So there were severe consequences from the accident, and consequences that I think anyone would want to avoid, even though it turned out that the radiation-related injuries were even the ones that will occur over time are expected to be very slight.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is, and I understand it's difficult in like the heat of the moment, especially September 11th. Of course, you want to ramp up security and everything. But I think just like now that we've had an opportunity to like look at a few different accidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, it seems to me when I talk to so many nuclear experts that we're still kind of cemented in our old ways of thinking. That like the maximum credible accident is one where thousands of radiation, if not millions of radiation deaths could occur. We just know that to empirically be false now. So I'm wondering if this calls for like an overhaul of what we think the real danger, the real threat is from nuclear. As we just talked about, it's really our overreaction that causes more damage than radiation does. And if this almost, now that we can like sit back and reflect upon these different accidents, if we can maybe declassify nuclear from being this like inordinate threat as opposed to any other type of industrial facility.
Well, you have had 3 real cases that are reassuring from the viewpoint of dispersal. I guess in fairness, the Chernobyl accident wasn't reassuring because it was huge dispersal of radioactive materials. But 3 Mile Island, negligible release. Fukushima, even though the containments were breached, negligible health effects as a result. So you have, that doesn't say there aren't other types of accidents that could occur in a way that just, that have adverse impacts. I wouldn't say, gee, they're foreclosed as a result of this. I do think it does encourage much more expansive thinking to put the radiation risks perhaps in a different perspective, but probably elevating the non-radiation risks as being the Fukushima accident being an example of the environmental and societal impacts of the accident were very severe. Economic impacts were severe. So you don't escape the need for emergency preparedness as a result of this. Perhaps it should result in some change of focus, perhaps a reduction of the singular focus on radiation-related injuries and realizing that there are other things that may be akin to what would happen if a severe chemical plant were to be destroyed, right. That would be worthy of consideration. Yeah. But that, this is sort of a giant ship that's focused, that's been, around the world, that's focused on radiation-related injuries as the foundation. And so, sort of pulling that out and changing it actually has disruptive effects all the way through the system. So it's not easy.
Yeah.
I have actually, since I've left the NRC, I've spent a lot of time on nuclear-related issues, both for the IAEA and in Japan, on trying to help them in their response to the challenge that arose from the accident. Yep. So that these are very much issues that are with us.
And we mentioned the evacuation related injuries. Does Japan acknowledge that at this point? Do they acknowledge that in the future, if this were to happen, that the evacuation can cause more harm than good? Is that spoken about, or is that still you're not allowed to say that?
Oh, I think the Japanese are very much aware of that. That is the conclusion of a variety of the international studies of the accident. And you can, I'm not anyone who can read Japanese, but I mean, this is not lost on the Japanese public at all. In fact, it sort of has aggravated the situation in the sense that, it's not an accident where, okay, the consequences occur and then it's over. This has been a situation of evacuations and the impacts and destruction of people's lives that has, been going on for now over 10 years.
Yeah.
And they're very conscious of that. And it creates a big problem because Japan is a country that does not have any indigenous energy resources. The cheapest electric power in Japan is nuclear. And if they rely on fossil sources, obviously that creates a greenhouse gas problem. But beyond that, a lot of their supply line has to come through the South China Sea. So they have a national security risk that's associated with dependence on foreign supplies of fuel. Yeah. So that Japan is a natural place to rely on nuclear power. But and I think the government realizes that. They clearly realize that because they've been basically, not very visibly, but basically trying to encourage these plants to continue to operate. Not very many are operating. But the Japanese public is still very hostile to nuclear as a result of the accident. Yeah. And, and that is a very unfortunate situation for Japan. They are in the middle of an effort to review their energy policy that will look at the situation as they're going out through the century as to what role nuclear should have. And they need to start thinking about the prospect they may need to build some plants.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. That was the next likely thought. Yeah. If
they are going to, and there are advocates.
Oh, that was it. Sorry, I lost you there for a second. You're saying there are advocates for building new nuclear?
There certainly are advocates, and within the government and outside the government. But it's not an easy decision to make politically, given the Japanese public's quite understandable concern about nuclear power.
Yeah.
So we have a situation, in which, they had like 52 plants beforehand, and they've got, I guess there's 16 that are sort of formally authorized to commence operation. Sort of 9 have been in operation, and some of them have shut down for other reasons. But they're basically, it's a small shadow of what it once was in terms of nuclear power's contribution. But they are looking at advanced reactors. They are thinking about alternatives that ideally would be safer and would be ones that might be appropriate to encourage free usage in Japan.
Yeah. Though on the safer point, like I hate to push back on it, but I feel like those plants were safe and the accident proved that they were safe. What was dangerous was the reaction to the accident, not the power plants themselves.
Well, I wouldn't say that you have several plants that got destroyed that you've proven they're safe.
But nothing can survive. I mean, come on, we can't expect anything to. You don't say a Ford isn't safe in Japan because it got hit. It also got destroyed by a tsunami, right? Like there are plenty of cars on the road that you say are still safe cars, but got wiped out by a tsunami. That doesn't mean they're not safe. That means the largest tsunami in the world can destroy infrastructure.
Well, that's true, but I wouldn't take a lot of comfort in the fact that you had a tsunami that took out a bunch of nuclear plants. And one could imagine a dispersal that was more severe that headed towards Tokyo or what have you. Maybe very unlikely, I agree, but nonetheless, there is a concern.
Yeah. And tell me about the Blue Ribbon Commission that you served on, looking at more domestic issues with respect to nuclear development.
Well, yeah, I did serve on the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. That was Lee Hamilton and Brent Scowcroft were the chairs of it. And I think, distilled some very common sense recommendations about how to proceed, and strongly urged that we need to deal with this waste problem, and had some suggestions about how we could do it. And it's, it keeps on getting cited and as being something that is a sensible approach, but we don't seem to be able to move off the dime on that. Mm-hmm. Some of that has to do with that this issue, unfortunately, has been caught in the middle of the partisan politics that are problem across many areas, many substantive areas in our country right now. And so it's a Republican-Democrat issue as well as a pro and anti-nuclear and, and every other kind of a view. And it would be wonderful to find a resolution to this issue, but I don't think anyone has the appetite to do it right now. And I don't think we have, given the state of partisan politics in the United States, I don't think it's very likely that we'll be able to find a route forward. But I think the report is there. Its recommendations, I think, still are sensible. And I hope someday we'll go forward and implement them. Yeah. One thing that has changed is that, there's some international progress, that there's nuclear waste facility that will be going into operation in Finland. There's a lot of progress been made in Sweden. The Canadians have made some great progress as well. The French are making progress. So we don't have quite the same story around the globe. There is some recognition of the need that this is a problem we need to solve, and some countries are being responsible in doing it. There is an aspect of this problem, though, that I've been worrying about internationally, including within the last week. We view and have advised through the international entity, IAEA, that every country that has a nuclear power plant should make plans for the disposition of its fuel. And the vision that the IAEA has had over the years is that every country will have its own repository. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Right. Countries with small numbers of reactors would be just hugely expensive to have a repository.
Yeah,
they may not even have the geology.
Yeah, I agree. So why did the IAEA ever get into that position? Like, they couldn't have had one conversation before making that recommendation and say, if a country's only got one plant, why can't it just work with its neighbor instead?
Well, they would say that every country has a responsibility for taking care of its nuclear waste. And it does, and they would now say that if you could make a multinational arrangement that is allowed under their safety standards, they are starting to think much more deeply about how to accomplish that. You need to have, you can see in the Middle East, you might well have a disposal facility, for example, of these new entrant countries that are coming together. Might be possible to do something there. But there's got to be one country that agrees to be the host, and you don't want to have the Nevada situation recreated in the host country all over again. So, I mean, this is and I say I'm chairing the International Nuclear Safety Group, and that was one of the subjects that we were briefed on by the IAEA staff in a meeting we held the middle of last week, virtually.
And what type of time periods, when they talk about disposal of nuclear waste? I've always thought this million-year requirement is just truly absurd. Why isn't something more realistic? Can't we assume that society will be more advanced technologically 100 years from now, that whatever tools it has at its own disposal is going to be way better suited than anything we could come up with right now? If we look back 100 years, they had horses and buggies. Now we have supercomputers. Can't we assume that 100 years from now they'll be better equipped and we just come up with 100-year solutions instead of million-year solutions?
Well, 100 years we could store it above ground.
So why, I don't understand why that's not a very reasonable proposal.
Well, the argument is that we're leaving a problem we created, that we produced this used fuel, for our in this case, our great-grandchildren to solve, and they have to bear the cost of doing that.
But you could also argue, if I put instead of putting $6 billion into research now, if I put $50 million into a fund and just let it accrue interest, for the next 100 years, that will also be better equipped financially to deal with it, not just technically, right?
Well, perhaps. I mean, that it does involve some assumptions about the preservation of society and so forth.
But then nuclear waste is the least of our worries.
Probably.
If we're assuming,
I do think that one has to approach this recognizing that there will be technical change, that there are opportunities that will arise to do things. I mean, there's a lot of energy value that's in some of the spent fuel, and we may create this disposal facility, and then within 100 or 200 years, we then view it as a mine and go
Or
back.
within 20 or 50 years, it seems like the nuclear people should be the most intellectually equipped to understand the value, the resource of the waste in terms of future energy production more than anyone. Just another reason it blows my mind why the recommendations are to think about this as a million-year problem that we have to solve today, given everything that we know about how technology changes, including nuclear reactor technology, and what a great resource this could be for future reactors.
Well, whatever you say here involves certain assumptions about opportunities and capacities and so forth. I do think that we have overblown the risk from a disposal facility. But the aim has been to show we can solve this problem. And anything that sort of leaves that open then presents an issue for the nuclear people. Well, gee, you're assuming something that may exist but may not, and that this is a vulnerability for nuclear power. I do remember a chairman of Exelon who was on the Blue Ribbon Commission who said at the time that he was never going to build a new nuclear plant if he couldn't assure he could take care of the spent fuel. It was just, I just felt it was a societal obligation he had.
But Exelon also owns coal plants, and he doesn't realize the societal damage that is caused by every gigawatt hour that's produced by coal instead of nuclear.
Oh, he very much would realize that, but he very much was a big advocate for dealing with climate change. It's just that he had a personal issue associated with.
Forget climate change. Let's talk about short-term impacts, air pollution. I mean, every minute that we leave a coal plant open in terms of air pollution, we are just tallying up the real deaths and real injuries. Meanwhile, commercial nuclear spent fuel has never hurt a single person in all of human history. I just don't understand how someone responsible for a utility could even unless he's anti-nuclear. I don't get it.
No, he wasn't anti-nuclear, but he saw climate change. He just saw this as a vulnerability for nuclear that needed to be solved. And I very much agree that you have real deaths that are occurring from coal plants that are not hypothetical deaths you get from imagined releases from hypothetical releases from nuclear plants. This is something for many reasons we need to deal with. And, fortunately, the economics now, or at least in the United States, are such that coal plants are going to disappear.
Though, I mean, compare nuclear against any other energy source, including renewables, on a material consumption or even on a waste basis, per energy. I mean, you're talking about 1,000-fold less waste even than renewables, when comparing against nuclear. Yeah.
The interesting thing, I encountered a fact that I had not quite realized before, that, everyone says that hydropower is this wonderful answer to climate change. And that can be true, but where you have a big impoundment behind a big hydro facility, you often have layers of anaerobic decomposition.
That's right.
Which is producing lots of methane.
That's right.
And so they're actually, the analyses of what the climate change impacts of hydro are all over the map, because it's dependent on the particular circumstances, and the algae and the anaerobic decomposition that can occur in the impoundments can be significant contributors.
I know. It could be as bad as hydro could be, although thought of as clean, could be as bad as fossil fuels from the methane release. Yeah, insane, isn't it?
I had not known that. I encountered that. I was doing some work on something and was looking at the comparative greenhouse gas impacts of various energy sources, and I saw that the scale of uncertainty for hydro plants was huge as a result of this. Of course, we don't have very many areas that necessarily going to be available for hydro, so this is not hardly a long-term solution anyway.
Right.
particularly for this country, but for many others that don't have the relief and capacity to exercise more hydro than they currently do. I'm sure there are some other opportunities, but this is not the response to climate change that we need.
Exactly. And have you taken a look at the next generation of nuclear technologies that are coming back? Do you keep apprised of this?
I do. Well, actually, at the moment, I am chairing a committee of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, the three, that is looking at the opportunities for advanced reactors as a response to climate change, and what are the barriers and the problems. And so we're sort of at the outset of a major study of this issue that'll go on for a year. And later this week, I'll actually be having a meeting, a public meeting, and we'll hear from X Energy and TerraPower about the natrium reactor. And so I'm very much in the middle of that now and learning a lot. And similarly, there are major activities underway at the International Atomic Energy Agency to prepare for the prospect of advanced reactors and trying to understand what the safety implications of them are. And they're doing a lot of work to try to determine the gaps in their regulatory system. That they have standards that are like ours, are much more general than the NRC requirements, but which are basically ones that are written against the thought of light water reactors. And they have a major effort to identify what things they need to consider reviewing. They're trying to look at a technology inclusive set of requirements so that they don't have to try to rebuild a whole new set of requirements for each different type of reactor. But that of course is what the NRC is trying to do as well. And Part 53, of course, is underway now to try to accomplish that. So this is something that has many regulatory dimensions that are going to have to be fixed, and of course many economic and other issues that need to be resolved as well. But it is encouraging that there are so many vendors who have ideas that have been able to raise money to actually proceed to develop them, being taken seriously by investors, and recognition that nuclear, at least in my view, has to be part of the response to climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Dick, as we wrap up today, any kind of final thoughts that you want to leave the audience? I know we've covered a lot here, so this has been excellent, but I was wondering if there's any other topics that we haven't covered yet.
Well, I think we have covered most of the things that I've been involved in. I mentioned I'm involved in Japan on something that actually was a theme that goes from my days at the NRC, which is we're trying to encourage much greater use of risk-informed insights in their regulatory process. That was something I championed when I was at the NRC. The reactor oversight process was put into place when I was there, as an example. And so I think that is a theme for the future. That is something the NRC is, of course, it's a bedrock now for how the NRC thinks about its regulatory system, and they're trying to use a risk-informed approach as they deal with advanced reactors, as they should. So, I think that I would just sort of emphasize that as being an important element that we also need to pursue for existing reactors as well as advanced reactors. But thank you for allowing me to join you. This has been interesting and been fun.
Yeah,
it's been useful to you.
Yeah, the pleasure's all mine. Dick Meserve, thank you so much.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.